Let me read to you a passage from the 18th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 15 to 20. It's the Gospel for Wednesday of the 19th week in Ordinary Time. St. Matthew writes, Jesus said, "If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there am I with them." That's from Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 to 20. What does it suggest to us? Well, just notice a feature of social and national life. I refer to the freedom to criticize and the prevalence of criticism. In any democracy, it is taken as a basic principle that criticism must be allowed. A free press is insisted on as a basic right of a democratic society because it is able freely to correct faults and wrongs being perpetrated in the society or in the world at large. Without that criticism broadcast before all, evils remain unnoticed and can thus proceed uncorrected. And with that criticism, legitimate opposition to the evil can be galvanized and perceived evils can be corrected. Again, a kernel of the modern democracy is the presence in its parliament of an opposition. The function of a parliamentary opposition is to criticize and correct. It criticizes policies of the sitting government, it freely expresses its corrections, and with the aid of media publicity, hopes to win the agreement of the population at large. The expression of correction is a basic necessity if evil is to be resisted and if good is to flourish. A fundamental institution of the democratic state is the ballot, and this too is a form of correction. The population is able to express and enforce corrections of perceived evils by its ballot. All of society depends on the presence of the power to correct. Within a family, it is evident that, though there can be abuses, parents must correct their children. All know that if there is no correction given, the child will be at the mercy of his impulses, not only as a child, but much more seriously, later as an adult. Parents too need to be corrected at times, and it is a further question who is to express the correction. Within schools, education requires the freedom to correct. Alternatively, take a society in which criticism and correction is not allowed. And there are many such societies. The press is supervised and becomes virtually a mouthpiece of the dictatorship. No opposition is allowed in the institutions of government. Schools become a form of indoctrination and churches are suppressed. All correction or criticism is put down. It is obvious to ordinary reflection that such a situation is profoundly unhealthy and a seedbed of great evils. Of course, correction can be given in bad faith and for a variety of self-serving motives. So there has to be discrimination in evaluating criticism, both when it is given and when it is received. But the value and importance of correction is what any reasonable person ought be able to see and act upon. Well now, what does Jesus Christ, the Son of God made man, have to say about all this? Does Christ speak of the giving and receiving of correction, which ordinary reflection shows to be fundamental for the health of individuals and societies? Yes. And he intends his confirmation of it to apply not only to society, but to the inner life of the church. As we heard in the gospel I read earlier, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now this is my point. This confirmation by Christ ought lead the Christian to be ready to give and receive correction, above all in the spirit of Christ. The spirit of the world is very different from that of Christ. The criticism so natural to the world is a criticism without love, and in particular without the love of Christ. Generally, this means giving it without love and resisting it when it is correction of oneself. It is a criticism that seeks to dominate and injure, and it is lacking in self-criticism. The challenge for the Christian in the world is to imbue his secular environment with the Spirit of Christ, and this includes that necessary component of his environment which is criticism and correction. It too must be evangelized and Christianized. The Christian in the media should strive to correct as would Christ. The Christian in Parliament should act in opposition with the Spirit of Christ. Correction within the life of the church ought be imbued with the spirit and example of Christ. That is to say, it ought be imbued with Christ-like love. In the gospel passage I read earlier, our Lord directs his disciples to correct the one who sins against another within the life of the church. Correction there, as everywhere, is necessary for the flourishing of the church, for the flourishing of the church's members, and for the flourishing of the one who is in need of correction. The distinctive thing is the spirit with which this is to be done. It is to be done with the Spirit of Christ, full of self-denying love. Imagine our Christian families, our schools, and life within the church were this to be done. Imagine if correction were to be given and also received only in the Spirit of Christ, and not in the spirit of the world.